Do the thing. Do the thing. Hey whoever's out there, I go by Grumblebug and I'm currently reading The Black Flamingo by Dean Atta. Today we're going to do a mid-year-ish freakout tag. Yes, it is currently August, which means we're actually more like 3/4 of the way through 2020. But I'm new around here, and I find these questions really helpful when I'm getting to know fellow readers or a new booktuber, so maybe you will too. We'll start with a big picture. As of recording this, I have read somewhere in the ballpark of 105 books so far in 2020. That sounds like a lot, so let me explain. A lot of things about 2020 have allowed me to be more aggressive with my reading habits, but still it is worth noting that of those 105 books, 49 have been graphic novels, volumized comics, a couple manga, things like that are more in the sequential graphic. I don't know how they classify it. I consider all those things to be in the same realm as books, which is why they're included in my reading count. But context is important, and I know what it's like to hear people on BookTube say, I read 25 books last month. And I imagine they were all 400 pages and I'm super intimidated. And maybe you're one of those people who does read like 20 books a month and they're all 400 pages, in which case you're awesome and probably have superpowers. That's not how it works for me, and I think context is important. So that's the big picture we're looking at. On to question 1. What is the best book that you've read so far in 2020? I always pause at the word best because it is so subjective. Not just from person to person, of course, but also just depending on when you ask me. That said, I do have 3 books in mind that no matter the context or my mood, I was thoroughly impressed by in very different ways. I'll start with A Woman is No Man. This book was written by Itaf Rum, who is a second-generation Palestinian American and is the daughter of Palestinian immigrants. It tells the story of an immigrant family across 3 generations of women, and we follow a handful of perspectives across 2 different timelines. At the center of this story are the tragic and mysterious deaths of the family's eldest son and daughter-in-law. And their eldest daughter is now a teenager, and she is piecing together what little she knows and remembers of her mother and her mother's life. Meanwhile, the daughter herself is facing a very similar narrative to the one that her mother experienced, where she's closing in around 17, 18 years of age, and her family is now starting to talk to her about marriage. I just read this in July, so I plan to talk about it at greater length in my wrap-up, because I do those now. That's cool. But in a nutshell, this author shows us the ways in which culture and trauma and the patterns of behavior and expectations that we pass down across generations all intersect. And what's more, the story looks at what happens when all of those external and really consuming forces collide with those individual qualities of personality and perspective that make all of us unique and how we respond to those things like culture and family. I should probably mention here that I am currently a graduate student studying to go into the mental health field, so all of this is right up my alley. The writing and how Rum weaves together the different threads of the plot, as well as how each character experiences those threads, is really well done. And the characters are so thoroughly fleshed out that despite my deep-seated yearning to hate some of them at times, I just couldn't quite get there, because previously in the book I had been made so well to understand what makes those characters tick and why they were the way they were, as frustrating as they were. This was a very hard read at times, and there are a number of trigger warnings that I'll talk about in my wrap-up, but it made me think, and it made me consider a perspective that I think I might have really struggled to empathize with before reading this. And that's what I'm looking for when I pick up a piece of literary fiction. I want to understand what makes a character tick, and I want to see things from a different perspective that I don't have based on my own lived experience. I'll also mention that the audiobook is narrated by an ensemble cast and is very well done as well, if audiobooks are your thing. The second book I'll mention is The Deep, which is a novella written by Rivers Solomon. I just read this in July, so I won't say too much here, and I also know that it's been making its rounds on BookTube the past several weeks, but this tells the story of the Wajinru, who are a sea-dwelling people. They are descended from pregnant African women who were thrown overboard into the Atlantic Ocean during the slave trade when these women were being transported from their homes to the United States. There is so much to this book, and I'm not the right person to talk about all of it, especially from a cultural perspective and the impact that has. But as someone who is training to go into the mental health field, as I mentioned, I was really impacted at how this author looked at trauma. We in today's Western society often talk about trauma as something that happens to an individual person in a very discrete way. It is a separate, distinct experience that a person has and deals with on their own. But the thing is, trauma doesn't stop with the person who experiences it. It has a ripple effect and an impact on every community and circle of people that that original person is a part of. And it's also passed down across generations in very real and impactful ways. This is something that we talk about a lot in my field. People can also handle trauma very differently. And for some, that can mean, understandably, wanting to shove a particular experience or set of feelings into a box and never looking at it, never thinking about it, trying to pretend like it never happened, which is, of course, a completely understandable and valid way to feel about something like that kind of experience. At the same time, there are some people who process a traumatic experience and afterwards look back and acknowledge that while, of course, deeply painful, those things are a part of their history. They are context for who they are now. And that in its own way can be very powerful. Solomon dives into all of that, and I realize this is a very abstract way to talk about the story. I haven't given a whole lot about the plot, but it's these greater themes and the way that Solomon built a story around them that I personally found really impactful. This is a novella, as I mentioned. It is short, it is less than 200 pages, but I'm already planning to pick it back up because I know that every time I go back to it, I'm going to take something new from each read. Extra bonus, the audiobook is narrated by Daveed Diggs, who might sound familiar to you depending on where you've been in pop culture recently. Again, does an incredible job. No one is surprised. And finally, the third book that I'll single out was New Kid by Jerry Craft. This is a graphic novel that is marketed as middle grade, but I want every adult to read it. It tells the story of a 12-year-old boy named Jordan who is starting at a new middle school that is exclusive, expensive, and predominantly white. Jordan is a scholarship student and one of only 2 Black students, I believe, a very small handful of non-white students that we see attending this school. Kraft has said that New Kid is loosely based on his own experiences as well as those of his 2 sons, and he uses the medium of the artwork to add so much depth and impact to the experiences that Jordan has of being an outsider in a space where the people around him can't understand the ways in which they are constantly othering him. This book deals with race, culture, unconscious bias, and what it's like to go through daily life in an environment that has been designed in a way that alienates you. And this is especially impactful because this is school. This is where Jordan theoretically should feel safe and supported so he can grow. Some of the things Jordan deals with are concrete realities that the medium really lend themselves to helping us as the viewer see more impactfully. So for instance, Jordan has to physically adjust how he presents himself, from his posture to what he's doing to pieces of his uniform that he's wearing, with every stop on the bus ride from his home neighborhood to his school neighborhood. He's constantly changing these elements so that he can continue to fit in with each sort of gradation in the population. In other scenes, Kraft uses the artwork to show us outwardly how Jordan feels inside, like he is a world apart from his peers. It is powerful, it is thought-provoking, it's fun, and though it definitely deals with some substantial topics, it will also make you laugh. We get to see Jordan being a kid and trying to find his way at a new school, making friends, dealing with bullies, both among his peers and among the administration, and meanwhile, he's trying to convince his parents that what he really wants to do is go to an art school. Another bonus! New Kid is currently available on Hoopla, so if your library uses that service, you should definitely check it out. It is fantastic. Okay, the rest of these questions should move a little more quickly, so we'll move on to number 2. Best sequel you've read. This was surprising, but on a wander through my local library, I picked up Wires and Nerve, volumes 1 and 2, which I didn't even know existed. These are a follow-up to the Lunar Chronicles. That's Cinder, Scarlet, Crest, and Winter. It picks up where Winter leaves off, but it is told in 2 volumes of graphic novels rather than through a traditional narrative novel. I enjoyed the Lunar Chronicles. They were fun, they were easy to listen to on audiobook while I was doing other things. The ending was a little too simplistic for my liking, and I felt like it was tied up with a bow a little too nicely, but okay, fine. These fix that. I won't say too much in case you haven't read the series and intend to, but Wires and Nerve follow Aiko, Cinder's faithful best friend who happens to be an android. And I appreciated this because of all the characters, I felt like Aiko had been the least fleshed out over the course of the original quartet of books. So we get a look at this question of what makes a person human, because Aiko is an android, but in many ways she presents as human. It also deals with a lot of the politics and logistical questions that were just sort of glossed over when Winter ended, which had been my main complaint with the series. This was fun. The new medium added a lot to the physical comedy and timing that I always feel like exists in Marissa Meyer's writing, and I was pleasantly surprised by what an adventure this was, and also how much depth it added to the ending of a series that otherwise I had fun with. New releases you haven't read but want to. So I keep aware of new releases through BookTube and the Indie Next list and mediums like that, but I'm not super devoted to reading things as soon as they come out or even the year they come out. It's just not realistic for me. I am very rarely willing to pay full price for a brand new, undiscounted, often hardback book, and so instead I much prefer to get those through my library, and naturally those wait lists are pretty long when they're initially released. So I get to them, but it takes me a while. That said, I do have a few books that came out this year and that I've managed to get a physical copy of in various places, and I'm particularly excited for those. Those are The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune, In 5 Years by Rebecca Searle, The Death of Vivek Oji by Akwaeke Emezi. This just came out like 4 days ago, but I subscribed to Book of the Month, and it was one of their August picks, so I chose that one, and I'm really excited. And The Beauty in Breaking by Michelle Harper. This was last month's Book of the Month pick for me, but I'm behind. Most anticipated release in the second half of the year. Peace Talks by Jim Butcher. Peace Talks is the latest release in the Dresden Files series, and it just came out in July. So yeah, that's before I recorded this, but it was still the second half of the year, so I'm counting it. This is the rare exception to my no buying brand new hardbacks at full price rule, which tells you how excited I am about it. This is a contemporary fantasy series following Harry Dresden, a wizard working as a private investigator and police consultant in modern-day Chicago. People seem to either truly love or really deeply hate this series. I haven't come across very many who are lukewarm, and that makes sense. Not only because preferences are subjective, people like different things, but also because this series in particular, where it starts versus where it is now, are vastly different places in scope of the world that we're dealing with, in the writing, in the plotting of individual books, and what we see the characters experiencing. Peace Talks is book number 16 in the series, so it is a journey, and one that I am clearly wholeheartedly invested in. Bonus, the audiobooks are narrated by James Marsters. He narrates the entire series, except maybe for one book where they changed the author, and my understanding is there was such a huge fan backlash that they immediately got rid of the guy and then re-recorded it with James. Anywho, James Marsters is Spike in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He has an American accent. It is confusing at first, but my God, does he play an excellent Harry Dresden. Biggest disappointment in 2020. Now, let me explain before you immediately decide you either love me or hate me / my reading tastes. I had heard so much over BookTube about The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is again a polarizing book, and it is very much a BookTube darling. Love it or hate it, it seems like everyone has something to say about it. I had gathered this was a very slow-paced, very dreamlike and atmospheric book. All true. That's about a magical circus, the experiences people have there, and this sort of dance-like back and forth rivalry between our two protagonists that takes place over the course of decades. Again, all true. All things that theoretically on paper I love. Based on what I know of myself as a reader, I expected to fall firmly into the love it camp with this book. I am a character-driven reader. I love immersive worlds and transportive writing. Add some magic on top and I am sold. It was okay. I didn't dislike it. It was enjoyable, but at no point did I really get sucked in and develop that momentum that keeps you reading without trying or thinking about it. I tried out different formats to see if that was an issue for me. I started out with a physical book, then I moved over to an ebook that I read as I was going to sleep at night. Eventually I picked up the audiobook and tried that as well. And despite using all three of those formats, it still took me a full month to read this book. So this was a disappointment, not because it was a bad book or because I didn't enjoy it, but because I am apparently one of the few people who had a lukewarm experience with it. And that's just not what I had been looking forward to. I expected to pick it up and immediately be like head over heels, couldn't stop reading. That was very far from what happened. Biggest surprise of the year. So two come to mind for this. The first was Bromance Book Club. I totally picked this up because of the hype. People went on and on about it in reviews, and I was very skeptical because I don't consider myself a romance genre reader. I'm not anti-romance by any means. I'm happy to have it as a subplot, but very rarely do I pick up a book in which romance is the main course, so to speak, rather than a side dish. But I love this. And I think that's because, to me at least, this was not a book about a falling in love sort of romance. It was more about romance in the context of a relationship. And when a person starts to realize that they need to grow and evolve because they are neither giving nor getting what they need to out of their current partnership. I should probably note here that I was taking a class on couples therapy at the time, so that might have impacted how I read this. I also really enjoyed the sort of tongue-in-cheek subversion that came from this really macho, hyper-masculine group of men who are professional athletes talking earnestly with each other about things like toxic masculinity and feminism and how important it is to identify and connect with both your own emotions and those of your partner. So that was lovely. One other surprise was Exit Stage Left, the Snagglepuss Chronicles. This is a comic book? Graphic novel? I'm not really sure which it is, but it's by Mark Russell, and I picked it up on a whim from my library while wandering through the comics section one day. This is a retelling of the classic Hanna-Barbera cartoon characters, so Snagglepuss, Droopy Dog, Huckleberry Hound, Quick Draw McGraw, that crowd. But it places them within the historical context of the New York theater scene during the Communist Red Scare. And Snagglepuss, as well as a number of his fellow characters, are living as closeted members of the LGBTQ community. This was dark and thought-provoking and informative about an era of history that I hadn't given a lot of thought to, and the ways in which, during that era, members of the LGBTQ community were persecuted, really, using the context and the public fears of the time. And apparently this won the 2019 GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Comic Book, which is a thing. I had no idea this existed. I did not know what I was getting into, and it was fantastic. That said, if you are a person for whom trigger warnings are important, look this up on Goodreads because those are definitely relevant. New favorite author. So this was the year that I picked up both of the prominent published works by Madeline Miller. I first read Circe and then I read Song of Achilles. These are retellings of classic Greek myths that have received a good deal of love and acclaim from the reading community, and I get it. For background information, I majored in classical studies in college, so basically the Latin language that is no longer actively spoken, as well as Greco-Roman literature, history, that whole shebang. And before you ask, I did in fact manage to secure gainful employment after graduating. I can understand the concern though. As someone who studied this segment of culture and literature, I was so impressed with the way that Miller manages to stay true to what we know has been handed down about these stories, while still managing to sort of look at the negative space. She builds these stories and human beings, well, maybe humans isn't quite the right phrase, people whose entire experiences take place within the gaps in the narratives that we have, the pieces that haven't survived through history or were never deemed important enough to tell. And in doing so, she tells the stories of people whom this cultural history hasn't given a voice. Often these people are women, or people of lower social standing, or otherwise just people who were deemed less important than heroes and gods, which is basically everybody. Circe tells the story of Circe the Sea Witch, whom Odysseus encountered on his voyage home from the Trojan War. She's traditionally thought of as a villain, but fun fact, her story hasn't been told until now. The Song of Achilles tells the story of Patroclus. He was the dear, beloved companion of the warrior Achilles. And ultimately, it was his death that set Achilles off into a rampage that ultimately turned the tide of the Trojan War in favor of the Greeks. I guess that's a spoiler, but also not. If you know anything about the myth, it's fine. It's fine. Miller's writing is gorgeous and almost poetic, I feel like. She has taken characters whom history and oral tradition have rendered really two-dimensional and voiceless, and she breathes life into them. I have loved both of these books. I plan to own and reread both of them, and I'm genuinely excited to pick up whatever Miller decides to write next. Newest fictional crush. Does it have to be the book version of a character? Or is a Netflix adaptation okay? We'll skip that one. Newest favorite character. I thought long and hard about this, and the most genuine answer I could come up with is Goose from Saga. Saga is a mega popular sci-fi / fantasy comic series that follows a couple who have fallen in love from either side of an interplanetary war. The series follows them as they, their daughter, and a revolving cast of reluctant allies / found family try to stay a step ahead of the very, very many people and factions that want to kill them all. And Goose is one of these found family members. He is a humanoid anthropomorphized seal. Of course, he's not a seal because he's from a different planet, but whatever, he's a seal. And he is faithful and loving and unassuming, but fierce as hell in protecting the people he cares about. And all in all, he's just delightful. I love him. And I also fear for him because Brian K. Vaughan has a habit of stomping on my heart. Do you read Saga? Do you know what happened in the final issue before hiatus? Because I do, and I'm still not okay. A book that made you cry. I am trying to remember whether I teared up while reading The Song of Achilles. It is very possible, but I can't quite remember. I know that I cried while reading Beyond the Point by Claire Gibson, but I technically finished that maybe 2 days before New Year's, so it doesn't count. Which leaves me with The Clockwork Princess by Cassandra Clare. Now, I'm not a ride or die Shadowhunters fangirl. I enjoy the stories. I think they're good as an escape. They're pretty easy to get through. They're usually pretty good audiobooks, except for that one dude that they use who is super broody and mumbles all of his words. He is annoying. In general, I preferred the Infernal Devices to the Mortal Instruments by a lot. I haven't read any of the other series though. But I was not super impressed by The Clockwork Princess. The plot, the villain, the climax, it was all just kind of meh for me. And so I was really just going through the motions and listening to the end of the book. And then that epilogue. Oh my word. The epilogue just, it just got me right in the heart. And it elevated the rest of the trilogy for me because it made all three books feel so much more important within the full context of the main trio's greater story together. And that's all I'm going to say. If you know, then you know. If you don't, then judge me. I don't care. The next question is a book that made you happy. And for the life of me, I cannot get a decent recording of my answer to this question. I don't know why. This is probably take number 12. I am not exaggerating. So I'm just going to list them, okay? My answers are The Trials of Morgan Crow. That is the first book in the Nevermore series. The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. And the first 2, maybe 3 issues of Moonstruck by Grace Ellis. That one, unfortunately, takes a very quick nosedive, somewhere around issue 3 or 4. I read The Girl Who Drank the Moon and Moonstruck in July, so I'll talk about those more extensively in my wrap-up, and hopefully I'll be able to get my words out then. And if you want to hear more about The Trials of Morgan Crow, let me know. Maybe I'll do a whole video on books that make me happy. I don't know, but this question is done. Most beautiful book you've acquired. I understand that people usually answer this with respect to book covers, which I get, but personally I thought it more appropriate to shout out The Witch Boy by Molly Knox Ostertag. This just showed up in the mail and I have not had the chance to read it yet, but it tells the story of Aster, who comes from a magical family in which boys grow up to be shapeshifters and girls grow up to learn witchcraft. But Aster finds himself far more drawn towards witchcraft than shapeshifting, which, as a boy, he's not supposed to feel a connection with, and this is not condoned by his family's traditions. This is a graphic novel, and my understanding is that neither sexuality nor gender identity are ever explicitly addressed in this story, but suffice to say that there's a big ol' metaphor here for gender stereotypes and gender nonconformity, which I think is kind of beautiful in its own way. Beyond that exploration, though, I'm really excited about the artwork. These are just the first few pages of the story, which Ostertag both wrote and illustrated, and I'm pulling these as screenshots from the book preview on Amazon, so you can check it out there for a better look. I think it's beautiful, and I'm really excited to read it, so this is my answer.
Hi, I apparently managed to lose the first part of my footage for the last question, so here we go. The last question for this tag is, what books do you need to read by the end of the year? And my blanket answer is yes, all of them. I need to read all of the books. In particular, this whole shelf, pardon the plant, of library checkouts, which has gotten so out of hand that I'm now concerned for its structural integrity. More specifically, I definitely need to read The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. And I need to reread Unsheltered by Barbara Kingsolver. These are for a real life, well, not real life, it's over Zoom, but it's for a book club that I'm a member of. So those are important. I will definitely read those, and presumably we'll also have picks for October, November, and December, and I'll read those too. Okay, we're done.
I also need to read Raising Our Hands by Jenna Arnold. So I won a copy of this book through a Goodreads giveaway back in March, May. It was springtime and it's been a while. So I need to give it a read and a review fairly soon. And I think I'll just read the first paragraph on the back. White women are one of the most influential demographics in America. We are the largest voting bloc with purchasing power that exceeds anybody else's, and when we unify to demand change, we are a force to be reckoned with. Yet so many of us sit idly on the sidelines, opting out of raising our hands to do, learn, and engage in ways that could make a meaningful difference. Why? I am curious at how Arnold is going to present this conversation. I think it's an important one, especially given the current dialogue about advocacy and the recent waves of protest tied to the Black Lives Matter movement. But I'm also skeptical, because theoretically, this book will eventually get down into how women who see themselves as falling into this group can start using their voices in pursuit of social justice and humanitarian issues. That's awesome and important. But my initial question is going to be why a person should pick up this book in particular, which is written by a self-identified privileged white woman, rather than one of the many phenomenal resources out there in which people who are themselves members of marginalized and systemically oppressed communities speak to their lived experiences, where they give their call to action and their perspectives on the issues that directly impact them day in and day out. But I haven't read it yet, so we'll see what happens, and that's all I'll say on it for now. All right, that's my mid-year, not really, but we're calling it mid-year book freakout tag. Thank you so much for sticking around and learning a bit about me as a reader in 2020. I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these titles down in the comments if you read them or if you're interested. If you'd like to learn a bit more about my thinking and hopes for this channel, you can check out my conversation with myself, in which I talk through all the reasons why I shouldn't start a BookTube channel. If this is a conversation you've had with yourself, it might look familiar. Additionally, if you want to hear more of my thoughts on some of these titles and the rest of the books that I read in July, subscribe, I guess? Maybe? You don't have to, but like you could. I guess I'm supposed to ask that. If you subscribe, then you'll see when I post my July wrap-up, so that's exciting. Otherwise, take care. I hope you read something good, and I will see you when I see you.